Most aircraft wrecks discovered after 60 years of submersion present as debris fields rather than airframes. The typical result of high-energy impact and prolonged saltwater exposure is a scattered footprint of engine blocks and disintegrated aluminum. However, the recovery target lying off the coast of Leros represents a structural anomaly. It is not a fragment. It is a largely intact three-engine transport aircraft resting on the Aegean shelf. Its survival is not a matter of luck, but a consequence of a structural approach Junkers pioneered early in the 20th century. Corrugated duralumin skin that stiffens thin metal without adding much weight. Every recovery begins with one blunt question. Will the airframe carry itself the moment it breaks free of the seabed? In this case, the target offers a unique opportunity due to its rigid construction. The subject is a Junkers U-52. This specific aircraft served with a Luftwaffe transport unit tasked with supplying German forces during the Battle of Leros. On November 13, 1943, it was shot down and lost. Since then, it has rested in the sediment between Alinda and Gorna Bays. While the historical record confirms the loss, the physical reality of the wreck dictates the engineering challenge. The aircraft sits at a depth of about 135 feet, roughly 41 meters. This places it within the reach of human divers, but outside the zone of simple recreational access. The mission objective is not merely to map the site, but to raise and recover the major airframe components for conservation and display at the Hellenic Air Force Museum. What makes this lift even thinkable is the U-52's corrugated duralumin skin. Smooth sheet can buckle once it is dented or eaten thin, but corrugation gets its stiffness from shape, not thickness. Underwater, that geometry is the difference between an airframe and scrap. In the context of an underwater wreck, this corrugation acts as a preservation shield. It resists buckling and helps the fuselage keep its form on the seabed long after impact and years of corrosion. The corrugation adds longitudinal stiffness that can help keep the tail aligned with the nose. But stiffness is not the same as strength once joints and fittings have been weakened by corrosion. For the recovery team, it means this is no debris field. It's one rigid body that might take a lift. However, the presence of this structure does not guarantee success. The metal has been immersed in a chloride-rich environment for over 6 decades. The corrugation provides stiffness, but it also increases the surface area exposed to the water. The location of the crash site adds a layer of operational complexity. The waters off Leros are subject to currents, and the seabed is a mixture of sand and silt that the aircraft has settled into over time. The team must verify that the airframe is actually the specific machine lost by Transport Geschwader 4 and not one of the many other transports downed during the campaign. Identification may require close inspection of any surviving tail markings, manufacturer plates, or stamped component numbers cross-checked against wartime records. The target is defined. The structure appears sound enough to attempt a lift, but its stillness hides a chemical war at the molecular level. On the seabed, it sits in a fragile equilibrium. Disturb it, and the chemistry wakes up fast. The team is looking at a 3-engine transport that seems ready to fly, but is really a corroded alloy framework held together by geometry and sediment. That preserved fuselage is the clue. Pointing straight to how the crew bled off impact energy in 1943. An aircraft impact is effectively a conversion of kinetic energy into deformation. If a transport plane weighing over 20,000 pounds hits the water at a steep angle or high speed, the structure cannot absorb the load. It shatters. The intact state of the Junkers 52 at the bottom of the bay suggests the final seconds of its flight may have been more controlled than a steep, high-speed impact. It is consistent with a ditching or low-energy water landing, though angle, sea state, and burial can also shape what survives. On November 13, 1943, operating in support of the German assault on Leros, the aircraft flew into airspace contested by Allied fighters and heavy anti-aircraft fire. Whatever struck it, propulsion or control authority was gone, and the crew had one option: ditch. The geometry is unforgiving: wings level, minimum controllable speed, a slight nose-high attitude, and no hard stall into the surface. The physics of this ditching rely on the square of the velocity. By reducing airspeed to the absolute minimum under control, the pilot reduced the impact energy by the square of the speed. The corrugated skin of the Junkers likely played a critical role here as well. Upon contact with the water, the rigid surface absorbed the hydraulic slap better than a smooth skin which might have torn open. The fixed landing gear of the U-52 presents a major hazard in this scenario as the wheels can catch the water and flip the aircraft. In this case, the aircraft appears to have come to rest upright on the bottom. Whether it floated for seconds or sank almost immediately, the result was the same. The cabin flooded and the airframe settled into the sediment. Once the aircraft settled on the bottom, the threat profile shifted from mechanical trauma to chemical aggression. Seawater is a corrosive electrolyte, and chloride ions penetrate seams and joints, breaking down aluminum's protective oxide film and driving pitting, crevice, and intergranular attack. Much of that damage is invisible. A wing surface can look solid while the internal structure is honeycombed, losing ductility and turning brittle. A spar that once flexed under the load of a banking turn might now snap if subjected to a sudden shear force. The environment also introduces the problem of galvanic corrosion. The Junkers is constructed primarily of aluminum, but it contains steel components in the engine mounts and landing gear. When two dissimilar metals are connected in a saltwater bath, they create an electrical circuit. The less noble metal essentially dissolves to protect the more noble one. In this configuration, the aluminum acts as the anode, losing material to the steel cathode. The recovery team must assume that every junction between steel and aluminum is a potential failure point. After decades underwater, the corrosion environment may have slowed in places where oxygen is limited, especially in buried sediment. The aircraft can remain relatively stable while undisturbed on the bottom, but that stability is conditional and can change as soon as the wreck is moved or exposed to fresh oxygenated water. However, this stability is an illusion. The structural strength that saved the crew in 1943 has been compromised by the chemistry of the Aegean Sea. The team is not lifting a factory-fresh machine. They are lifting a brittle shell that is held together as much by the surrounding silt as by its own rivets. The evidence of the crash is preserved, but the material holding that evidence together has been fundamentally altered. The decision to recover the aircraft introduces a severe physiological risk that has nothing to do with the wreck itself. At that depth, the absolute pressure is about 5 atmospheres, roughly 5 times the pressure at the surface, and it dictates every minute of the work schedule for the Hellenic Air Force divers. The primary hazard is nitrogen loading. When a diver breathes compressed air at depth, the nitrogen in the mix dissolves into the bloodstream and tissues. The deeper the dive and the longer the duration, the more nitrogen is absorbed. If the diver ascends too quickly, this dissolved gas expands into bubbles, causing decompression sickness. To manage this risk, the team uses a set of tables derived from the U.S. Navy Diving Manual. These tables act as a strict operational clock. On standard U.S. Navy tables, the no-stop bottom time at this depth is on the order of 10 minutes. This is barely enough time to descend, locate the worksite, and inspect a single component. To accomplish the complex task of rigging a 20,000-pound aircraft, the divers must exceed this limit. They are committed to 70 repetitive dive cycles over the course of the project. Each dive incurs a nitrogen debt that must be paid back with time spent at shallower depths or on the surface. The team utilizes a staged decompression profile. After completing their work on the bottom, the divers do not return directly to the surface. They pause at a series of prescribed decompression stops, holding at set depths long enough for nitrogen to off-gas before the final ascent. This requirement transforms a 20-minute working dive into an hour-long event. The dive master must track the exposure of every individual to ensure they do not cross the threshold into permanent injury. The workload at depth is physically demanding. The divers are not just observing, they are excavating silt and threading heavy lifting straps through the airframe. At 41 meters, the breathing gas is denser, increasing the work of respiration. Carbon dioxide buildup becomes a secondary threat, limiting the physical exertion a diver can sustain. A diver panting for air at this depth is on the verge of panic or unconsciousness. The team must work methodically, avoiding sudden bursts of effort. The operational plan allocates a total of 22 hours of bottom time to prepare the aircraft. This is not continuous time. It is broken into short, high-intensity shifts. The divers operate in pairs for safety with a standby diver ready on the surface. They use an underwater communication system to coordinate with the surface supervisor, but the primary link is the dive plan itself. Everyone knows the sequence: clear the silt, locate the spar, thread the strap, secure the shackle. This segmented workflow creates a continuity problem. One team might start a task like tunneling under the wing root only to hit their time limit before finishing. The next team must descend and pick up exactly where the previous pair left off without losing the progress to the shifting sediment. It becomes a slow relay race run on the dive table's schedule, and the schedule always wins. The margin for error is non-existent. A mistake in the timing or a rapid ascent due to equipment failure could result in a diver needing immediate recompression chamber treatment. On an island operation, rapid access to a recompression chamber can be limited, so evacuation planning becomes part of the dive plan. The safety of the team relies on strict adherence to the numbers. They are working at the edge of the envelope where the physics of gas absorption clash with the necessity of manual labor. The site is rigged, but the physics of the lift presents a new danger. The recovery of the aircraft hinges on a single geometric problem: lifting a 20,000-pound object packed with sediment and weakened by corrosion without tearing it apart. Lift bags can provide buoyancy, but as they rise, the air inside expands and the lift can run away, sending a wreck upward too fast to survive. The team instead uses a floating crane barge so the ascent can be controlled inch by inch, at the cost of one new constraint. The entire load must travel through a few chosen lift points on the airframe. Choosing these lift points is a critical engineering decision. The fuselage of the Junkers 52 is not a solid beam. It is a collection of frames and stringers designed to take aerodynamic loads, not point loads from a crane. If the divers attach the straps to the wrong part of the airframe, the cable will simply shear through the aluminum like a wire through cheese. The team identifies the main spar of the wing as the only component strong enough to bear the stress. The main spar is the structural spine of the aircraft. It runs through the fuselage connecting the wings. By looping the lifting straps around the wing roots where they join the fuselage, the team engages this central girder. This lift point geometry ensures that the lifting force is distributed through the strongest part of the skeleton. The divers thread wide cargo belts under the wing roots to spread the load further, preventing the straps from crushing the corrugated skin. Before the lift can begin, the team has to break the suction of the seabed. After 63 years in sand and silt, mud grips the belly like a vacuum seal, and the force to peel it free can exceed the aircraft's own weight. Pull too hard and the release can snap a cable or jerk the airframe apart. So the divers free the contact points first, letting the wreck release smoothly when the crane finally takes the strain. On October 3, 2006, the crane operator begins to apply tension. The cable tightens and the operator watches the load carefully. The goal is to lift the aircraft slowly, letting mud and water drain as it rises so the slings are not shocked by sudden weight shifts. The ascent is a slow vertical crawl. The divers monitor the rigging as the aircraft leaves the bottom. The load balance is critical. If the aircraft tilts too far, nose down or tail down, the straps could slide off the spar or crush the tail section. The center of gravity shifts as sediment and water release. As the aircraft nears the surface, the external pressure drops, and the balance can change again as trapped pockets vent and buoyancy shifts. The aircraft breaks the surface of the Aegean Sea for the first time since 1943. It hangs suspended from the crane, dripping silt and water. The mechanical risk of the lift is over, but the chemical risk is about to reach its peak. But the instant it hits air, the next threat begins. The moment the Junkers 52 clears the waterline, the operational profile shifts from structural engineering to chemical defense. For 63 years, the aircraft existed in a low-oxygen environment. The sediment and the water formed a protective cocoon that slowed the rate of corrosion. By lifting the wreck into the atmosphere, the recovery team introduces a massive influx of oxygen. This acts as a catalyst for a destructive chain reaction. The primary enemy is the chloride residue trapped within the structure. Underwater, it stayed diluted, but the moment air reaches those seams, the salts concentrate and the thin moisture films turn electrically active. Left untreated, the wreck can show more visible loss in days on deck than it did in decades on the bottom. And salts aren't the only thing that wakes up. Oxygen and wet salt also drive the galvanic couples already built into the mixed metals, pushing aluminum to dissolve around steel. Time is now the enemy. Now, the team has one viable option to halt this process. They cannot dry the aircraft immediately because that would trigger crystallization. They cannot leave it coated in seawater because that fuels the galvanic reaction. The decision is to flush the entire structure with fresh water immediately. This is not a cosmetic wash, it is a chemical countermeasure. The goal is to dilute the concentration of chlorides on the surface and wash away the electrolyte that connects the steel to the aluminum. As the crane lowers the dripping fuselage onto the barge deck, the preservation team moves in. They use hoses to blast the mud and salt from every accessible crevice. The corrugated skin, which provided structural strength during the lift, now presents a cleaning challenge. The waves in the metal trap silt and salt, requiring the team to spray from multiple angles to ensure total coverage. They must reach the internal spaces of the wing roots and the cabin floor, where sediment acts as a sponge holding the salt water against the metal. The barge becomes a wet dock. The team works methodically from the nose to the tail, trying to reset the chemical baseline of the artifact. This freshwater treatment creates a new logistical constraint. The aircraft is now heavy with trapped rinse water and the structure is wet. It cannot be allowed to dry out in an uncontrolled manner. The team must transport the wreckage to the Hellenic Air Force Museum as quickly as possible. Every hour the aircraft sits on the barge is an hour where the damp crevices are vulnerable to the return of oxidation. The fresh water slows the decay, but it does not stop it permanently. The metal is stabilized, but the final journey to the museum remains. The journey from the barge deck to the museum floor is not a simple transport operation. It is the beginning of a long-term chemical engineering project. The Junkers 52 recovered from the Aegean Sea is no longer a functional aircraft. It is a massive archaeological artifact that requires a controlled environment to survive. The freshwater blast on the barge only buys time. Now the permanent work begins. Desalination. The aircraft is transported to the Hellenic Air Force Museum at Dakalia Air Base. Here, the recovery team faces the reality of the evidence they have retrieved. The structure is intact, but it is saturated with chlorides. Surface washing cannot reach the salts trapped deep within the grain of the duralumin, or inside the overlapping joints of the corrugated skin. To remove these contaminants, conservation teams typically begin with partial disassembly into major components. Wings may be separated from the fuselage, engines may be removed from their mounts, control surfaces may be taken off. This disassembly serves a dual purpose. It allows inspection of internal damage and it permits components to be immersed in treatment tanks. Desalination relies on diffusion. When a salt-saturated component is placed in clean water, chloride ions migrate outward toward equilibrium. Conservators monitor the conductivity of the bath. As salts leach out, the water becomes more conductive. When levels plateau, the water is drained and replaced. Depending on condition and thickness, that cycle can continue for months. If the process is stopped too early, the remaining salt will eventually migrate to the surface and restart the corrosion cycle from the inside out. The corrugated skin that helped the aircraft keep its shape now complicates desalination for a different reason: diffusion and circulation. The folds and riveted overlaps create sheltered boundary layers where water exchanges slowly, forcing agitation and careful tank management so chloride ions can migrate out evenly. Once the chemical threat is neutralized, the team addresses the mechanical stabilization. The goal of the museum recovery is not to restore the aircraft to flight condition. Attempting to make the engines run or the controls move would destroy the historical fabric. The objective is static preservation. The team applies corrosion inhibitors to the aluminum and protective waxes to the remaining steel components. They reassemble the airframe using modern fasteners where the original rivets have failed, but the patina of the wreck is largely preserved. The dents from the ditching and the scars from 63 years on the seabed remain visible. The outcome of this operation is the preservation of a rare data point in aviation history. The Junkers 52 is often called the workhorse of the Luftwaffe, and a limited number of airframes survive in museums and collections. Far fewer, however, retain a combat loss context that can be tied to a specific fight like Leros. Most museum exhibits are pristine restorations that hide the reality of their operational lives. This aircraft preserves the evidence of its loss. The bent propellers and the scarred airframe tell the story of the mission on November 13, 1943. The recovery answers the central question. This is the U-52 lost off Leros, its outline preserved by Junkers' corrugated duralumin, even as seawater chemistry hollowed it out. That's the proof. But more importantly, it transforms a degrading hazard at the bottom of the sea into an educational artifact. Preserved by the Hellenic Air Force Museum at Decalia Air Base, it stands not as a monument to a pilot or a general, but as a testament to the engineering that built it and the technical discipline that brought it back to the surface. The gap in the historical record is closed.